This is what a sine wave really looks like. It may not be the depiction you're used to, but it's a more authentic visualization of the sound you hear as a sine wave. Sound is a pressure wave, compressions and rarefactions of air radially spreading outwards into space. To create these bursts of air in different densities, we need a speaker, a membrane pushing air out and then pulling it in again hundreds of times a second. If we graph these movements of the speaker over time, our sine wave might start looking a bit more familiar. Its peaks signify the air being pushed together, while its valleys tell the speaker to pull it apart. However, we're not done yet with the simplifications. To save these instructions for a speaker on a computer, we need to turn them into discrete bits of information, thousands of samples per second that describe the outline of a sound wave. This is where two terms you've probably heard before come into play. The sample rate describes how many chunks of information per second we store, while the bit depth describes how many possible amplitude values these samples can take. A 16-bit bit depth means 2 to the 16th, so 65,536 possible values per sample. According to the Shannon-Nyquist sampling theorem, the highest frequency we can store this way is just below 2 times our sample rate. A nice intuitive explanation for this is that we need at least 2 samples to describe a wave cycle, one for each peak and one for each valley. Because the human ear can only hear frequencies between around 20 Hz and 20 kHz, the most common sample rates we use are 44.1 kHz or 48 kHz. 44.1 is the standard for music, while 48 is more common in video because 48 kHz is nicely divided into the common 24 frames per second. As for edge cases like higher harmonics being introduced by nonlinear processing or the intention of slowing the audio down, which effectively means reducing the sample rate, these two rates are perfectly adequate. They cover every frequency a human can possibly hear. If you're making music for your cats, however, you might want to work at higher sample rates. Bit depth doesn't normally cause any problems, as long as you don't touch it. If you reduce it, however, it can cause an ugly type of distortion known as quantization distortion. By applying dither, a specifically designed low-level noise, we can significantly reduce this effect. Here we've got a sine wave. By reducing the bit rate, we don't only add noise to the sound, but also some specific higher frequencies that aren't harmonically related to it. Notice that by introducing dither, we don't just mask these frequencies, but they actually go down in volume. If we remove the dither again, these frequencies will go up again. This might make more sense if we look at it on an oscilloscope. You can see how reducing the bit depth reduces the amount of possible volume that the sine wave can take, and this kind of stair-step effect is introduced. Adding dither might locally reduce the precision, but because the noise averages out to the waveform, you can see how the overall shape is actually preserved better by adding a little bit of noise to the sound. Your DAW probably works at a depth of 32 bits or higher, while audio files are usually stored at 16 or 24 bits, depending on if they're likely to be processed further. Either way, when exporting you'll be reducing the sample rate, and to prevent quantization distortion, you'll want to apply a dither. Most DAWs will do this automatically whenever a sample rate is being reduced. Needless to say, what I just showed you was a very exaggerated example of this normally quite subtle effect. The simplest way to save the raw data, sample by sample, is in a WAV file. This is the way you will likely want to save any audio intended to be further processed. A FLAC file is a bit more clever. It exploits patterns in the audio to shrink the file to about half the size. FLAC stands for Free Lossless Audio Codec. The lossless means the compression from a FLAC causes no changes to the audio information. The file can be reconstructed perfectly, sample by sample, bit by bit. This makes FLAC a popular option for distributing music in the highest quality possible. MP3 is a way to even further reduce file size by letting go of parts of the audio spectrum that are masked by louder frequencies. Depending on your settings, this can be done either quite aggressively to drastically reduce file size or quite subtly. Most people probably won't be able to hear the difference between a high-quality MP3 file and the original audio, but unlike FLAC, the difference is not zero. During playback, this MP3 file is then converted back into individual samples, which are converted into a voltage, which is converted into pressure waves by the membrane of your speaker, which then reaches you and is converted by your ears and brain into the sensation of a sound.